The smell of mildew was something I had learned to ignore. That, and the sound of the water heater kicking on every few hours, rattling the thin wall beside my cot, like it was trying to remind me where I had ended up. The basement, my son-in-law's basement, 67 years old, 31 years as a licensed civil engineer, a man who had once signed off on bridge load calculations that kept thousands of people safe every single day, and I was sleeping on a cot next to a water heater, eating whatever my daughter remembered to leave at the top of the stairs. That was where my son found me. Not the man I used to be, not the version of me who coached his Little League games and taught him to change his own brake pads in the driveway on Saturday mornings. He found the other version, the one with the hollowed-out eyes and the collarbones pushing too hard against the skin and the bruise along my left forearm that I kept trying to explain away as a door frame, even though we both knew the door frames down there had nothing to do with it. He stood at the bottom of the stairs and just looked at me for a long moment. He didn't say anything right away. My son has always been the kind of person who needs a few seconds to absorb something before he responds to it, and what he was absorbing was apparently significant enough that those few seconds stretched into something longer. Then he said, very quietly, "Dad, how long has this been going on?" And I didn't know how to answer him because the honest answer was humiliating in a way I still hadn't fully accepted. Let me go back to where it started, because it didn't start in that basement. It started the way most disasters start. Slowly, reasonably, with someone you trusted telling you something that sounded like it made sense. My wife passed away 4 years ago. Lung cancer, 18 months from diagnosis to the end, and I would not describe that time in detail, because some things belong only to the people who lived them. What I will say is that when she was gone, the house we had shared for 34 years became a different kind of place. Not empty exactly, but altered in some fundamental way, like a song played in the wrong key. I stayed there for 8 months after the funeral, and then I made what I thought was a sensible decision. I sold it. The house sold for $412,000. After paying off the remaining mortgage and the fees, I walked away with $340,000 in liquid assets. Combined with my pension, $6,400 a month from my engineering firm's retirement plan, I was, by any reasonable measure, financially comfortable. I had options. I could have bought a smaller place outright. I could have moved into a senior community. I could have done a dozen different things that would have kept me independent and secure. Instead, I listened to my son-in-law. His name is Brandon. He married my daughter Claire 9 years ago, and for most of that time I had no serious complaints about him. He worked in insurance, which seemed appropriate because he had always struck me as the kind of man who understood how to manage risk in his own favor. He was attentive at family dinners. He remembered to shake my hand firmly and ask about my golf game. He sent a card every Father's Day, which Claire probably reminded him to do, but still, I had no reason to dislike him. What I did not see, and what I should have seen, was that Brandon had been paying very close attention to my finances for a long time. Not obviously, not in any way I could have pointed to and named, but looking back now, the questions he asked over the years were not casual. They were reconnaissance. 6 months after I sold the house, Brandon came to see me at the apartment I was renting. He sat across from me at the kitchen table with his elbows on the surface, and a look of genuine concern on his face that I now understand was practiced. He told me he had been thinking about my situation. He said that as someone who worked in financial planning adjacent fields, he was worried about me living alone with that level of liquid assets, and no one to help me manage decisions if something happened. He used the phrase cognitive decline twice in that conversation, very gently, very carefully, as if he was reluctant to bring it up but felt obligated. I was 65 years old and sharp as I had ever been. But when someone you trust uses that phrase while looking at you with that expression, something shifts. Some small internal gear slips. You begin, despite yourself, to wonder. He proposed a solution. He and Claire had a large home, 4 bedrooms, finished basement, good neighborhood. They had been talking about it, he said, and they wanted me to come live with them. Not as a burden, as family. He framed it as them wanting to take care of me, wanting me nearby, wanting me to have support as I got older. Claire was on the phone with me that evening, and she was warm in a way she hadn't been in a while, and she said all the right things about how much it would mean to her to have me close. I should have asked more questions. I know that now. I know it the way you know things after they've already cost you something irreplaceable. I gave up my apartment. I moved into their basement, which they had set up with my furniture and a small bathroom and a television, and which felt, at first, like a reasonable arrangement. And then, about 3 weeks after I moved in, Brandon mentioned the power of attorney. He explained it to me the way you explain something to someone you assume is slightly slower than you. Patiently. With visual aids, almost he had printed something out. He said that having him designated as my POA was simply a protective measure, an insurance policy, he called it. In the event that anything happened to me, a health emergency, an accident, a situation where I couldn't act on my own behalf, he would be able to step in and handle things. He said it was what responsible families did. He said Claire had already agreed it was the right thing. And here is the part that I have had to sit with, the part that still makes me ashamed when I think about it. I signed it. I signed it because he was sitting across from me in his own kitchen, with his hands folded and his voice even and measured, and because my daughter nodded when I looked at her, and because I was still, even then, somewhere inside the grief of losing my wife and the disorientation of selling the house I had lived in for 3 decades, and I trusted him. The change did not happen overnight. It was gradual enough that I kept finding explanations for things that should not have required explanation. The bank statements that stopped coming to my name, Brandon mentioning, offhandedly, that he had set up an account to consolidate my assets for easier management. The first month I asked about my pension deposit, and he said it had come in and he was keeping track of it, not to worry. The second month when I asked again, and he seemed slightly irritated, as if the question itself was an imposition. By the 4th month I understood what had happened, but understanding something and knowing what to do about it are 2 very different things. He had transferred my savings into a joint account structured in a way that gave him effective control. He was redirecting my pension payments, my $340,000 and $6,400 a month money I had worked for across an entire career. Money my wife and I had planned our retirement around was being managed by a man who had decided, somewhere along the way, that it belonged to him. When I tried to talk to Claire about it, she told me I was confused. She said it gently, the way Brandon had said everything, but the word landed the way it was meant to land. Confused. The word he had planted months ago when he first mentioned cognitive decline. She said Brandon was handling everything responsibly and that I should trust the process and focus on resting. She said I needed to stop getting worked up about things I didn't fully understand. That was when I was moved to the basement, not explicitly, not with a confrontation. It was presented as a suggestion that I might be more comfortable with my own separate space, more privacy, more independence. I accepted it because I did not know what else to do. My cell phone plan had been changed and my data removed, which Brandon explained as simplifying the billing. I had enough credit on the phone to make calls, but not enough to easily look things up or contact people without asking first. I want to explain something about why I didn't call my son sooner, because I know it's the obvious question and I know how it looks. My son lives 4 states away. He and Claire have had a difficult relationship for years old, sibling frictions that hardened over time, and Brandon had always had a talent for widening that gap when it was convenient. After I moved into their house, contact with my son became something that felt complicated in ways I couldn't fully articulate. Brandon would make comments, casual ones, about how my son never visited, how he didn't seem concerned about how I was doing, how it was interesting who showed up when family needed them and who didn't. None of it was said cruelly. All of it was corrosive, and I was ashamed. That is the most honest answer. I was ashamed of what I had signed and what I had allowed to happen and what I would have to admit if I asked for help. I kept thinking I would figure something out on my own. I kept thinking it couldn't go on much longer. I kept thinking a great many things that turned out to be wrong. My son arrived on a Tuesday in November. He hadn't told me he was coming. He told me later that he had been trying to reach me for 2 weeks, and that the conversations had felt wrong in ways he couldn't name, too short, too careful, with silences in places where there shouldn't have been silences. He said he had a feeling, the kind you can't argue with, and he got in his truck and drove. Brandon answered the door. My son asked to see me. Brandon said I was resting and that it was probably better not to disturb me. And my son said, with a politeness that apparently did not leave room for argument, that he would like to see me right now. I heard the footsteps on the stairs, and I sat up on the cot, and I was aware, suddenly, of how I must look. I had lost probably 22 pounds since moving in. I hadn't been to a doctor in months. The bruise on my arm was from a week earlier when Brandon had grabbed me on the stairs during an argument about money, his hand tight enough to leave marks, though I had been telling myself it wasn't what it was. My son came down those stairs, and he looked at me, and he said quietly, "Dad, how long has this been going on?" And I finally told him the truth. All of it. Every piece I had been carrying alone for months in that basement. My son sat on the edge of the cot and did not interrupt me, and did not tell me I was confused. He listened the way he had always listened fully, with his whole attention. And when I was done, he sat quietly for a moment. Then he asked if I still had my cell phone. I told him yes. He asked if I had taken any photos of the bruise. I hadn't. He took his phone out and photographed my arm carefully, from 3 angles. He asked me to describe every financial interaction I could remember, dates, amounts, what Brandon had said, and he typed notes into his phone while I talked. He was systematic in a way that told me he had already been thinking about this, already preparing for something, before he even walked into that basement. "Dad," he said, when I had told him everything, "I need you to understand something. What's been done to you has a name. It's elder financial abuse, and it's a crime. We're not going to handle this by arguing with him or asking nicely. We're going to handle it correctly." He went upstairs. I could hear the conversation in a general way without being able to make out specific words. It was not a long conversation. My son has a particular quality when he's decided something, a stillness that is somehow more authoritative than volume, and I imagine that quality was present in that kitchen. He came back down and told me to put everything I wanted to take with me in one bag. We were leaving that day. I packed what mattered. My wife's photograph from the windowsill, my engineering license, which I still had the original of, in a manila envelope, some clothes. My son carried the bag up the stairs, and I followed him, and Brandon was standing in the kitchen with his arms crossed, and an expression I had become very familiar with, the one that was positioned as concern but was actually something colder. Brandon said that I wasn't in a condition to make this kind of decision on my own, that my son didn't understand the full picture, that the power of attorney meant he had the legal responsibility to. My son set my bag down by the front door and turned to look at him. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move toward him. He took off his watch and set it on the kitchen counter very deliberately, the way you set something down when you want to mark a moment. And he said, "I am going to give you exactly one opportunity to stop talking. After that, I will stop being polite." Brandon stopped talking. We went to a hotel that night. My son called his wife to explain where he was and why he wouldn't be home as planned. He ordered room service because I hadn't eaten a real meal in 2 days, and he sat across from me while I ate and just kept talking to me normally. About his kids, about the drive, about a project he was working on, not because the topics mattered, but because he understood that I needed to be treated like a person again for a while before we got into everything else. The next morning, he made calls. The first thing I need to tell you, because it is the thing I wish someone had told me before any of this started, is that a power of attorney is not a permanent transfer of power. It is revocable. If the person who granted it is still mentally competent, and a standard cognitive evaluation would confirm I absolutely was, they can withdraw it at any time with a written, notarized revocation. Brandon had allowed me to believe, through careful implication rather than direct statement, that signing the POA had given him something permanent. That was a lie constructed from omission. My son found an elder law attorney that first morning. She was a woman who had spent 20 years specifically on cases of elder financial abuse. And when my son walked her through what I had described, she did not look surprised. She looked focused. She told us that the structure of what Brandon had done, the consolidated account, the pension redirection, the isolation tactics, the physical intimidation, constituted multiple actionable offenses. The revocation of the POA was filed that afternoon. Notarized, properly structured, delivered to the relevant financial institutions within 48 hours. Brandon's access to my accounts was frozen while the legal process began. What came out during the discovery process was thorough and damning. My son's documentation from that first day, the photographs of my arm, the time-stamped notes of everything I told him, the record of my physical condition on arrival, formed the foundation of the case. My son had also, during those few minutes in the kitchen while I was still in the basement, done something I didn't know about until later. He had used his phone to photograph several documents he saw on the kitchen counter, including a bank statement showing transfers that had no legitimate explanation. The attorney was very direct with us about the process. "These cases," she said, "take time. They require patience." The goal was not just to recover the assets, but to ensure accountability, and accountability through proper legal channels required building a case that could not be dismantled by a clever defense. Brandon hired a lawyer. The lawyer was good. He argued that Brandon had acted in good faith as a designated POA, that the consolidated accounts were simply organizational, that my physical condition was the result of my own choices, and that the bruise was incidental. He was building a narrative of a caring family, managing a difficult elderly relative, and he was building it competently. But competent narratives require competent foundations, and the foundation here had cracks. The bank records showed, once subpoenaed, that approximately $276,000 of my savings had been moved through accounts that Brandon controlled, with a substantial portion going toward expenses that had nothing to do with my care or well-being: home renovations, a vehicle, credit card payments for purchases that predated my moving in. The pension redirections were documented. The timeline showed clearly that these actions had begun within weeks of my signing the POA, which the attorney argued demonstrated premeditation. My daughter testified at the civil hearing. I will not describe that day in detail. What I will say is that she looked different from how I remembered her looking when I was still healthy and comfortable and didn't need anything from her. She looked smaller. She answered questions about what she had known and when she had known it, and the answers were not comfortable answers, though they were more honest than I had expected. I think somewhere in the months that had passed, she had begun to understand what she had participated in, even if she hadn't had the courage to stop it. The judge was a man in his 60s, close to my own age. He had the manner of someone who has reviewed a great many documents and has developed a precise sense of when the documents don't match the story being told. He reviewed everything quietly and methodically, and when he spoke, it was with the particular even-handedness of someone who does not need to perform authority because they have it. Brandon's attorney argued for leniency, argued for the complexity of family dynamics, argued that everything could be resolved through mediated financial settlement. The judge listened without interruption. Then he issued his ruling. The remaining assets were to be fully returned. Restitution for the documented transfers covered the funds that had been spent, with interest. Brandon was ordered to pay my attorney fees. The civil judgment was forwarded to the district attorney's office, which had already been contacted by my attorney, and criminal charges for elder financial abuse and 1 count of elder physical abuse were subsequently filed. I was not in the courtroom when the final criminal sentencing happened. I was already in my new apartment by then, a 2-bedroom unit in a complex with a pool and a fitness center and a view of a small lake that I drink my morning coffee looking at. I had my accounting firm on retainer. I had a financial advisor who communicated directly with me and only me. I had my son's number at the top of my contacts, and the standing understanding that I called him every Sunday evening. My attorney called me after the sentencing. She told me the outcome, and I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment after she finished. Outside the window, the lake was doing what lakes do in the late afternoon, going golden and quiet. There is something I want to say directly to anyone watching this who recognizes something in what I've described. Not the specific circumstances, maybe, but the feeling of it. The way a situation can tighten around you so gradually that by the time you understand how constricted you are, the idea of asking for help has become its own kind of shame. The way someone who wants to exploit you will use your love for them, your desire not to create conflict, your reasonable wish to be seen as mentally and emotionally capable, as instruments against you. What I should have known, what I am telling you now because I needed someone to tell me, is that A power of attorney signed when you are fully competent does not take away your rights. It does not transfer ownership of your property or your finances. It is a limited authorization that you can revoke at any time, in writing, with notarization. No one can redirect your pension without your active participation, unless fraud is involved. And if fraud is involved, there are remedies. Legal, real, effective remedies. There are adult protective services in every state. There are elder law attorneys who specialize in exactly these situations, and many offer initial consultations at no charge. If you are being isolated from your family, if someone is managing your finances in ways you don't understand and aren't being shown, if you are being made to feel that your questions are symptoms rather than reasonable concerns, those are not signs that you need to be managed. Those are signs that something is wrong, and you are allowed to say so, and there are people whose entire professional purpose is to help you when you do. Staying silent did not protect my family. It did not protect my relationship with my daughter, which is now something we are rebuilding slowly, from scratch, with a great deal of honesty that is sometimes hard to sit with. It did not protect my health, or my finances, or my dignity. Silence only ever protected Brandon, and Brandon did not deserve protection. My son came to visit me last spring. He brought his 2 kids, and we went to a minor league baseball game on a Saturday afternoon and ate bad hot dogs, and his youngest fell asleep against my arm in the 6th inning. Driving back, my son said something that I have thought about since. He said, "You know what I kept thinking when I found you down there? I kept thinking about you teaching me to change those brake pads, how patient you were, how you wouldn't let me give up on it until I could do every step myself." I asked him what that had to do with anything. He said, "It had everything to do with everything. That's who you are, Dad. That's who you've always been." I looked out the passenger window at the highway going past. It was the kind of evening that comes in spring before the humidity sets in, cool and clear. And for a moment I was aware of how full the world still was of ordinary good things. Baseball, bad hot dogs, the weight of a sleeping child against your arm. The gavel had come down, and the truck had pulled away, and the accounts had been restored, and the documents had been filed, and all of that mattered. All of that was necessary and right. But this was the thing that mattered most. My son driving, easy and quiet. The road ahead wide open. My life, still mine. There is a detail I haven't mentioned yet, because I wanted to leave it here, at the end, where it belongs. When my son came back down to the basement after his conversation with Brandon in the kitchen, before he told me to pack a bag, he stopped at the bottom of the stairs and looked around at that space for a moment. The cot, the water heater, the bare concrete floor, the single lamp I'd been given. He looked at it the way someone looks at something when they are deciding exactly how angry they are allowed to be. Then he looked at me and said, "This ends today." Not a question, not a promise with conditions. A simple statement of fact, delivered by a man who had already decided what he was going to do and was simply informing me of it as a courtesy. He was right. It ended that day. I want to be clear about one more thing before I close, because I have thought about it and believe it is important. I am not telling this story because I want you to think less of my daughter. I want you to understand what happened with her, which is different from condemning her. She was in a marriage with a man who had a talent for making you feel that the thing he wanted was also the reasonable thing, the practical thing, the thing a clear-eyed person would obviously choose. She had been told, over years, a particular story about me, about my mental state, about my reliability, about what I needed and what I was capable of, and she had believed it because it came from someone she trusted, and because believing the alternative would have required a reckoning she wasn't ready to have. She called me 6 months after the sentencing. It was the first time we had spoken in almost a year. She didn't make excuses. I was prepared for excuses, and for the particular exhausting work of sitting with them. But she didn't offer them. She said she was sorry. She said she had known something was wrong for longer than she had admitted to herself, and she had chosen not to look at it clearly. And that choosing was hers, and she owned it. She said she didn't expect things to go back to the way they were, and she wasn't asking for that. She was asking if there was any path forward at all. I told her I didn't know yet. I told her to give me time. She said, "Okay, Dad, I understand." We talk on the phone once a week now. It is careful and sometimes awkward, and we are both feeling our way in the dark. Two people trying to figure out what they still are to each other after something that cannot be undone. It is not what I want. What I want is the relationship we had before any of this. The easy Sunday dinners and the sense of her being someone I could count on. That version is gone. But this version, halting, honest, uncertain, is real. And real things, even damaged ones, have somewhere to go if you're willing to keep working on them. My mornings go like this now. I wake up in my own bed, in my own apartment. I make coffee in my own kitchen. I look out at the lake. I have a list on the counter of the week's plans, a Thursday lunch with a friend from my old firm, a Sunday call with my son, a Tuesday appointment with my financial advisor who sends me statements I read myself and question myself and sign off on myself. Small rituals of an independent life that I once took completely for granted and now understand to be worth protecting with everything you have. 67 years old. Not confused, not in decline, not a burden to be managed or an asset to be extracted. Just a man drinking his coffee, watching the light change on the water. Still here, still mine,